Hi, I'm Ethan Alter from Yahoo Entertainment. We're sitting here today with Sir Kenneth Branagh talking about his new film, All Is True, about William Shakespeare and other films from his illustrious career as well. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Let's start off talking about All Is True. Now, I'm sure you've gotten this question before, but you've obviously acted in Shakespeare plays, you've directed Shakespeare films for most of your career, but you've never played Shakespeare himself until now. Why did you decide now was the time to do it?
Well, this bit of his life, when he finished producing all these plays, he'd either authored or co-authored 37 plays. He'd had 20 years of a career acting and producing and writing and directing in his theatre, other people's work as well. He comes back to Stratford, and it's a bit of the Shakespeare that's been presented on screen, often brilliantly, like in Shakespeare in Love, has been somebody in the middle of a romp, you know, a kind of fascinating romp that at least superficially Elizabethan England must or might have been, in addition to all the other things that it was, plague-ridden and fire-ridden and everything. But to see the sort of universal point of connection here was the boy returning to the small town home from which he emerges unlikely to go and be a world conqueror, and comes back, and of course, however spectacular, you know, the achievements of individuals, when they come back into their own home, families, partners, children may not be nearly as impressed. So this idea of putting a Shakespeare who we didn't know or weren't so familiar with, the man from the great romping sort of comedies of the cinema where he's been presented, but instead a kind of, in a way, a more recognizable, familiar, maybe dare I say, the more ordinary kind of guy, coming back to work out what he makes of his life, and particularly what his family makes of him.
There's been a lot of talk about or a lot of attempts to understand who Shakespeare was as a man outside of his work. What sort of inspiration did you find? Did you find inspiration in his plays, or did you do more historical research to sort of characterize who he was?
Both, actually. I mean, there are more sort of items in the Public Record Office than you might think. So we find out, and we include it in the film, that there were several sexual scandals involving his daughters that occurred and are recorded in the parish register in Stratford. People did stand up in church and denounce his daughter Susanna. They denounced the husband of his younger daughter Judith. And they also were unable to account for the reason for the death of his son Hamnet, who died when Hamnet was 11. And he also was involved in various property deals. He went to some pains to buy a coat of arms for £20, or about $5,000 today, so that he might be called gentleman. And he did return after a disastrous event at the Globe Theatre in Act 1, Scene 4 on June the 29th, 1613. A stage device, a cannon that was announcing a piece of pageantry in his play Henry VIII, went off and sent some shot into the thatch of the Globe Theatre, and the entire thing burned down. 3,500 people just got out with their lives. And so we start with that very specific, accurate historical point, and we bring him back home, and we try and find how we can join those factual events. And sometimes it's with the thematic material in the plays, like across half a dozen plays, he deals with the idea of the loss of a child. And so coming to terms both in his own mind and heart, if you like, with the loss of his son, but also what the impact of that tragic loss had on his wife and his two daughters, two of whom could not read or write, was really where we started to join the fact and the fiction. So it's fiction based on fact, and it was brilliantly written, I think, by a writer called Ben Elton, who himself had written 3 series of a very funny situation comedy series called Upstart Crow, which, with the brilliant David Mitchell, takes Shakespeare to a comic extreme. But it meant that Ben, our writer, was very well versed in the facts of the life and the plays to make this kind of movie where you try and see where the genius meets the man.
And Blackadder back in the day.
Yes,
Ben Elton's Blackadder is wonderful. The movie is called All Is True, but as you said, there is fiction mixed in. What's the biggest liberty you've taken for the film?
I suppose the speculation about how Hamnet might have died, and we do that with a a nod towards the late plays of Shakespeare, where he often writes about loss, and where often daughters are provocative with him and are feisty with him. And many of the late plays, particularly the last four plays, the romances as they call them, The Winter's Tale and The Tempest and Pericles and Cymbeline, all seem to me anyway to have this very human desire for lives to have happy endings. But Shakespeare knows that life is an ambivalent business at best, and happy endings are sometimes thin on the ground. Life is usually, there's a bit of yin and yang going on in all our lives. But what he does in those plays from a sort of dramaturgical point of view is he decides to use magic. Those last plays are fairy tales. He brings in, deus ex machinas that are flying fairies or, ancient myth tellers, or it's simple, straight up and down magic. A statue comes to life. And so I found that very touching. It's almost as if with a man who has suffered and who has lost and observed a life where other people experience the same things, tries with a sort of touching, almost childlike, playful quality to make it all right in a form that says, I know you know that it's not real. And it touches on a contemporary of his from Spain, Cervantes in Don Quixote, who describes such things as madness. But mad to see, the quote I think is, perhaps too much sanity is madness. Maddest of all, to live as life is rather than as life could be. And Shakespeare in these last plays, and maybe in his own life, is trying to arrive at an ending as it could be, not necessarily the way life provides it. So for me, it puts a sort of poignant hue on the whole episode.
In terms of your portrayal of Shakespeare, do you think of him? Do you think you're playing the man, or do you think you're playing an aspect of him as you would a character in one of his plays, as you played Hamlet in the past, or Henry V? How did you think of him in your portrayal of that?
Well, that's an interesting question because, it's all a guesstimation. It's all a speculation, and the raw material is. I looked at perhaps some of the characters that, at least in my humble estimation, he seemed to, this is just an actor's insider's view, there's no logic to it really. Characters that I think Shakespeare was particularly fond of would include Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing. And I think one of the things in Benedict that he liked was a strong sense of humour, a strong sense of self-deprecation, a sort of a silly streak, loyal, passionate, very sort of male in a way, not alpha male, but very, very sort of genetically programmed in certain kinds of ways that I don't think are misogynistic, but in fact, the story of Much Ado absolutely suggests that Benedict is a bit more comfortable, at least in male company, than female company. It's not that he doesn't have romantic feelings towards Beatrice, as Shakespeare amusingly pursues it. He was a kind of a role model, for a sort of a man who didn't take himself too seriously. And I have that sense about Shakespeare. When I was preparing the look, and I went to the National Portrait Gallery and I sat and looked at the Chandos portrait of Shakespeare, the thing that strikes you, as it often does when you look at masterpieces in the flesh, is the life. And the life in his eyes was so friendly and teasing, I would say. It was sort of provocative. It was funny. He almost encouraged you not to take him too seriously as you stood in London's National Portrait Gallery at NPG 1, the very first acquisition of that gallery in 1847. Surprise, surprise, the British nation decided they'd put Shakespeare in as the first participant in the National Portrait Gallery. So it came with a certain kind of a drum roll, but the portrait itself just teased, and so I found myself being drawn to a Shakespeare. To try and answer your question, was it a part of him? Yes, I think it was a part of him that was self-mocking, full of appropriate but not heavy introspection. I think he was a man, in our screenplay anyway, surprised to have arrived at this sort of summit of creative achievement and who didn't sit there atop some great sense of being the big I am, but was still right in the middle of being a human being. That's what I saw in the portrait, and that's what I tried to do.
And how did the portrait affect how you make yourself appear in the movie? Because you are wearing some makeup. How did that help you sort of design?
I wanted to do both things really. Is just get that warmth in the eyes, but then hide me and produce basically what people have been seeing on tea towels across the centuries, and on key rings and T-shirts and placemats and things. And because at least most of the evidence in the sketchy world of Shakespeare, where many would argue we don't have much to rely on, in terms of the painterly representations of him, I think the most compelling evidence is that a man called John Taylor in about 1608 painted this portrait for which other evidence suggests Shakespeare would have sat. So of all the paintings, maybe a dozen candidates, I think it's the one where you think, oh no, he was there. So that look was one I felt honor bound to try and recreate. And I also wanted to disappear myself.
Right, exactly. Yeah, when you put on in this case, you've extended your nose, you do other things. How does that make you as an actor feel when you have that? When you look in the mirror, do you lose yourself at that moment?
You do. I mean, quite literally, you start very early in the morning because there's quite a lot to do. We had two brilliant makeup designer, Vanessa White, and a brilliant prosthetic designer, Neil Gorton, and we had 3 or 4 huge test days ahead of the shoot and got the time down to about an hour and a half. I would close my eyes as it started, and I would open my eyes, and this other being would be in the mirror. And it was, any time I wanted to switch back, it was really just a question of looking in a mirror to know that, director and actor had gone and this other fella remained. So it was quite a ritualistic and definitely immersive thing. And it did feel we were in a single location, which was a house of the time, and we looked to the grand masters for our lighting, so Vermeer for the daytime shots and Rembrandt for the nighttime shots. And with Rembrandt, it was really just candles. When the candles were on, you couldn't see, you didn't see cameras. Everything fell away. The light fell away so quickly that we were very immersed. So by the time you sort of had a quick look in the mirror to be shocked by who you were, and then everything else fell away, you time traveled. It was very, very effective in taking you back.
One thing that's not addressed in the movie so much is the question of authorship, and there's been, obviously, the debate still rages about people, the school of thought who thinks Shakespeare didn't write his plays. Is that something that you wanted to address in any way, or do you just not traffic in that theory anyway, and wanted to?
Good way of putting it. I don't traffic in those sort of arguments. I think the speculation is all fascinating. So I have nothing but respect for those who have alternative theories, which are often brilliantly expressed and very compelling, to be perfectly honest. But I'm equally compelled by the story of the man from Stratford, and so I wanted to go to the facts in the Public Record Office and look at exploring a different side. For instance, Roland Emmerich made an excellent film, Anonymous, beautifully done, and I enjoyed enormously, about an alternative theory that the Earl of Oxford wrote these plays. But I wanted to really explore the idea of a so-called lowly individual who, at 18, in a shotgun wedding, leaves Stratford with a pregnant older wife and goes to London and passes through what academics refer to as the lost years, when we don't really know where he was and we find it hard to track him, and then suddenly he's in London and being successful in the early 1590s. We don't know if he really went to grammar school. We don't know how widely traveled he was. Some evidence to suggest a little. But it also brings up, when you try and follow through the line of the man from Stratford, I think you challenge the idea that all art is autobiographical, and you present the idea that the power of the imagination, as incentivized by an access to books. We know that this man had that access to the great writers. He went to the source he went to were all the classics. He went to Plutarch, the great lives of the Romans, and Holinshed, the English chronicles of the English kings, and Danish myths, and so he transformed them. So I mean, I think it's kind of wonderful that we don't know, but the man from Stratford is who we focused on in this film, and I was very pleased to follow through that line of thought because, of course, that side of it is rather, I think, inspiring in terms of someone who comes from, in the broadest sense, the wrong side of the tracks. And becomes the great poet of the age. Not that life is necessarily about fulfilling great ambitions like that, but just that a distance can be traveled is something kind of inspiring.
Or genius comes from the most unlikely of sources.
Yeah. I always remember being surprised by reading the letters of Mozart when he was a young man, and there he was writing music some people regarded as angelic, godlike. A hotline to the creator is what this man had. Sublime beauty. And yet you read his letters home, and he's scatological and pretty potty mouthed, very entertaining. But he isn't the angel whose every breath is a kind of is the music of the spheres. And that just is what it is, isn't it? And he happens to be a genius. Go figure. Put the two things together, or don't.
I want to touch on the political side of Shakespeare's plays and stories, because I think that we can always find a political moment for one play. Certainly King Lear is on the mind of a lot of Americans right now for reasons not just Trump, but other, I think of the Murdochs as well, this idea of an aging barons of certain, who then have to pass it on and legacy. Do you sort of see King Lear as an apt play for this era in the Trump times we're in?
It's very relevant. It always is, and for different reasons. I do think that King Lear touches on very pertinent things. First of all, a sense of contained outrage by previously voiceless people. And when King Lear, in his folly, decides, okay, I'm going to divide up the kingdom, and all you have to do is tell me how much you love me, that once the third daughter decides she will not go along with telling him he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, that the explosion that follows, that eventually ends up in a revolution, taps into a barely contained rage that I think is out there right now from those who've not been heard before, or those who feel they have been subjugated by regimes of whatever kind, domestic or commercial or political. And then the gap in understanding, as you might call it, between those who have assumed or believed they understood things about what other people understood, and then are astonished at the rifts, the depth of feeling, the distance between people in terms of point of view or even perspective or understanding in any way, is astonishing and seems to require or unleash a desire for the destruction of people with a different point of view. So there's a tremendous lack of forgiveness in King Lear as well that is perhaps also something that our world is experiencing as a sort of savage and judgmental and instant and violent division. So from that point of view, fairly pertinent.
Yeah. There was a production of, I believe it was Macbeth last year, where there was an overt Trump figure on stage, and it was done in Central Park. When stagings do that, make politics as explicit, does that hurt the work for you? Do you prefer to try and keep those direct one-to-one comparisons out of productions?
I think that they can be incredibly powerful and important and pertinent, and sometimes they can reduce an idea, and that can be a disappointment for an audience that might be able to understand more than the single and explicit idea that a certain leader is a bit like another leader that we know. But it's perfectly valid. I have no problem with people sometimes just being in your face and active with it. I think there are no rules. My lesson about Shakespeare, amongst many, has been that it's that which allows it to be alive. So if somebody feels emboldened or strong enough to approach a play where they are as direct as that, then I think it means they have a passionate response, and that means the work is alive, even if it's alive because people are provoked or in disagreement. and that produces an electricity, a tension that is what the live theatre is all about.
Besides Comedy of Errors, is there a play that you think encapsulates Brexit? If there were to stage one that would capture that.
Oh, what an interesting question. Well, I don't know. I think you come back to King Lear again, actually, which frankly is about a division between England and France, where very different points of view about hands across the water is understood. And right at the beginning of that play, there's from the Duke of Burgundy, and then the King of France, is a sort of astonishment at the English attitude, if you matter. They really don't know why this division is in place in the kingdom. So once again, I'd say and in Shakespeare and in King Lear, of course, they quote astrological circumstances as well. I was at a funny football match the other day, and a friend of mine who was watching the same set of incredible turnarounds said, "It's a crazy moon day. It's a crazy moon day." Shakespeare plugs into a few crazy moon days, and he lets the French identify one at the beginning of King Lear. Maybe that's the Brexit play.
I like it. Let's move from the Shakespeare universe to another universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, it's recently ended with Endgame. That just came out. You were there for one of the first films in it, making the first Thor. Have you seen Endgame? Have you followed the
I've certainly followed up to this point. I have not seen Endgame. I can tell you, it might make my Marvel family happy. I tried on the opening weekend to book six times in 6 different theaters near me, and in all cases, there were no seats available. So, and I was traveling the second weekend, so it's a treat ahead. But I spent the last 2 weeks saying to people, "Don't tell me, no spoilers, please don't tell me what happens to Thor. I know something happens to him. Leave it. Let me discover it myself." So,
going back to those early days, I mean, what's so fascinating about when you directed the first one is you helped build that universe. There had not been we hadn't gone to space before you created Asgard. What do you most remember about sort of the early days of having that impact of creating the larger universe? How did you feel about doing that?
I was aware that Kevin Feige and Luis D'Esposito, Vittorio Alonso, etc., all really knew that Thor was critical to them. That's how they put it to me. I mean, they knew it much better than I did, but that tonally, to find a way to sit alongside Robert's brilliant Tony Stark and Captain America, this new dimension, the fantastical, the space adventure, needed to find its place, its starting place. Anyway, it was going to, as it has done, evolve very considerably, but there was real concern around that. They felt. I don't think it's an exaggeration. They felt that if they didn't get that one right, it was going to be really, really difficult to allow for the expansion of that tone across the rest of what they planned. I have to say, though, at that stage, as brilliant as they've been, and as an amazing achievement that's been produced, they never assumed they had ideas, but they just never assumed it was going to do what it did. So they very much at that stage were taking it one movie at a time. And it was almost 1 week at a time, 1 day at a time with the script and with the casting. I remember Kevin Feige pacing around the table on the Saturday morning when we decided that we were going to ask Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston. We made the same calls the same morning within 2 minutes of each other. Chris was in Vancouver and Tom Hiddleston was in London. And Kevin said these will be the most important calls we make. And they were, because who knew what amazing chemistry they would have. And all I would say is that they arrived at those decisions. Kevin Feige is an amazing fella, and he applied all the care and consideration you could, up to the point where still it was going to be an act of faith. You know, you were still going to be leaping off into a big unknown world where the terror was. Don't let it be like Fabio. Don't make it Fabio.
Chris Hemsworth gets to have a few moments of comedy in that first movie. Specifically, I'm thinking when he's drinking the coffee and everything. He's really leaned into that in progressive movies. Do you almost wish retroactively you could have had a funnier Thor back in that first movie?
No, I think that we needed. I always think that if you're going to have the humor that is undercutting, you have to set it up against something. You've got to, and the movies do that very, very well in order to stretch as far as they can in the direction of comedy, but you've got to set up a sort of mythology, and in this case, a kind of dynastic architecture that allowed for people to understand high stakes, emotional content. And then I felt like you really had needed to get a big peg in the ground with that to have where probably in that first one you would be erring more on the side of trying to establish some sense of the sort of legitimacy of the science in as far as you can, but then just how much it mattered to Odin and Frigga and you know to everybody, and the depth of the companionship between all of those warriors, etc. And also to, before it could go in all the other directions it goes in, to really set up that sort of fraternal friction between Thor and Loki, which I think has turned out to be a real sort of lodestone for much of what goes on elsewhere. So I think it was our job to be, if not exactly more serious, we had to take seriously that side of it. I'm glad we did, because you know they've run with it in brilliant ways since, and I think you have to have it come from somewhere.
I have to ask about the visual choice of using a lot of Dutch angles. That's something that certainly marks your film compared to other ones. What was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, it was as simple as this. That I read the comic books, and all I saw was the images in those angles. I loved that they were often, you know, perspective twists and shifts. I liked, you know, big foreground faces. I liked making things or people look bigger or having more things in the frame. For me, it was an absolute and easy attempt to find the dynamism of the comic books. That's how I would read them. And it always amazed me, actually, that people, I know quite a few people, you know, that weren't crazy about it, but I kind of so glad that we did it, you know, and because it has quite a distinctive look, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it's unlike any other Marvel movie. It makes it distinctly yours.
Yeah.
I want to also ask about Dead Again. That's one of my favorites of yours. It's a wonderful thriller, and I think it qualifies as horror too. There's some great scares in it. One of the scenes I always remember is Andy Garcia as an old man with the cigarette in his throat. What was the? Can you tell a little bit about how that came together?
Well, Scott Frank, brilliant screenwriter and a wonderful collaborator. He'd had this screenplay. Had been in many fingers had been on it before I got there. I think many people had struggled with how they again managed this sort of tonal mixture. There's a straight up and down thriller in there, but there's reincarnation, and included in it is are certain kinds of effects, like this moment you mentioned, Andy Garcia as a very important figure in a story that takes place in the 30s. We now meet him in the present day. He's a very heavy smoker, and he's had a tracheotomy. He begs the detective who's trying to work out the story in the future to give him a cigarette. He lights it and he puts it into the hole in his throat and smokes it. I shall never forget the reaction of the preview audience the first time we played that. It was from 500 people all at once. And you thought, oh, well, listen, we've got their attention. We've definitely got their attention. And my God, you know that man, that's what smoking can do to you. It was the kind of thing that was absolutely part of what Scott created there, and I was very thrilled that Jordan Peele cited Dead Again as a picture amongst many that had a kind of impact for him and his new picture, and I'm proud of it because it was bold of Paramount to let us do it, and to also let us use black and white and color to help tell the story in the past. And also we had, I had to persuade Paramount to cast what I thought was this very good actress that I thought that they'd be hearing a lot more of, called Emma Thompson. And it took a moment. They reckon in the end talent will out, and it did. But there were a number of things that we got under the wire. It was Patrick Doyle's first Hollywood movie score, and he did a great job on that. So I loved working in that thriller mode, and loved being in LA making a movie.
The black and white sequences almost have a Edgar Allan Poe-esque feel to them. I don't know if you were thinking about it. In The Masquerade, felt like a Mask of the Red Death.
Yeah, we went very gothic, and when we found how we shot at Roman Strauss's mansion in a house in Pasadena, and we actually built gothic towers on it. Tim Harvey, the production designed 3/4 of the films that I've made, felt that we could go further in terms of almost a Hammer horror approach to the thunder and lightning that would accompany the exterior of this house. All of the buildings, like the Hightower house at the end, this very extraordinary house up in the Hollywood Hills that was used by Robert Altman in the movie The Long Goodbye, they all had a strong graphic silhouette themselves. I've always liked that, especially in those kinds of movies, feel as though the place, the weather, and the house itself has a personality. So you want to find as many sorts of characteristics. Maybe it goes back to those Dutch angles, you know, and the German expressionism. I've always loved the images of your Dr. Caligaris and your metropolises, and you know, and they often characterize the buildings as strongly as they do the people.
The ending where you is very Hitchcockian, the way you have people jumping out of the shadows and you have the scissors as a weapon. What did that doing those scenes teach you about how cinematic violence functions or cinematic action functions?
Well, it was interesting to fetishize scissors, to just suddenly, we all know they can be sharp, they all know they can cut and they can stab, but if you across the course of the movie have just peppered in the idea that they're almost an ultimate weapon, and then you're brought to the house of an artist who sculpts, draws, paints only scissors, then you had this chance also to, the Hitchcock reference is interesting because a movie that did influence it was Spellbound, where there was a sequence by Salvador Dali, as you know, that had that sort of quality of transforming household objects into dangerous things. And it was also cinematically an interesting thing to go, well, how many different ways can we make scissors look scary? And I really enjoy a shot where they fly across the floor, they're kicked across the floor, and we had them on a wire come all the way to my character before they were stopped. And then, you know, without spoiling it for those people who may not have seen the film, but I draw your attention to it.
See it now,
again,
it's great.
It is available in various media. Scissors become an important part of the ultimate denouement in an even more sort of grotesque way. So it was part of that atmosphere in a thriller like that, of starting to make you feel you had to look around because domestic objects were now taking on a different kind of resonance for you.
And you worked with Robin Williams on that film. What are your memories of that? Well, he has a small but memorable role. What are your memories of working with him on that?
He plays a character called Cozy Carlyle. He works in a supermarket. We did several of our scenes in a freezer. He's a brilliant, brilliant artist. Very funny, very serious, of course, as many great comics are, very serious. One-on-one. If there was one other person in the room, he was on. But when you got him on his own, it was fascinating. He also appeared in our film of Hamlet. He was Osric at the end of that movie. And I enjoyed working with him very, very much. I personally regarded him very, very, very highly as an actor, because that sort of that sensitivity, that sort of open-souled thing, tremendous courage. I remember we'd just finished shooting Hamlet, and I spoke to him that evening on the telephone, and I said, "Do you want to come over and a bite to eat? I know you're traveling home tomorrow." He said, "No." I said, "I'm going to the Comedy Store." I said, "Are you going to see something?" He said, "No, I'm going to go on." He said, "Do they know?" He said, "No, I'm just going to show up." I said, "Do you have any material?" He said, "No, I don't. I don't know what's going to happen." But he was almost vulnerable in saying so. It was a compulsion, a necessity, part of his life's blood. But it really, when it came to acting in scripted material, I thought that it, even with a character like Osric, very pompous in some ways, he brings vulnerability and depth and a sort of an emotional weight. He did it in both those parts, and he was, in both cases, it was his presence in Hamlet was a significant factor in getting that movie financed, and it was a significant factor to have him in Dead Again when I was with my second film with Paramount, and to have that kind of support. He was a big, big movie star at that time. Was really critical, so I thank him for that.
I have many more, but I think we have to stop there. Is that right? Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having Sir Kenneth Branagh here in Yahoo Entertainment Studios. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.